The Masque of the Red Death. Complete audiobook. The Red Death had long since ravaged the country. Never had there been a plague so deadly and so horrible. Blood was its emblem and seal, the red horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then the pores would ooze blood profusely, ending in death. The scarlet spots on the body, and especially on the face of the victim, were the stigma of the plague, which removed him from all help and compassion from his fellow men. In half an hour, the whole process was accomplished: symptoms, progress, and end of the disease. But Prince Prospero was bold, happy, and shrewd. His domains now half depopulated, he one day called to his presence 1,000 healthy and cheerful friends from among the ladies and gentlemen of his court, and with them secluded himself in the secluded retirement of one of his walled abbeys. It was a large and magnificent complex of buildings, conceived in the eccentric, yet stately, taste of the prince himself. It was surrounded by a high and strong wall. The wall had iron gates. When the courtiers were inside, forges and huge hammers were brought in, and bolts were welded shut. It was resolved that there should be no way of getting in or out, if anyone should suddenly give in to despair or madness. There was plenty of provision. With such precautions, the courtiers could defy contagion. Let the outside world look after itself. There were jesters, there were minstrels, there were dancing girls, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. Inside was all these, and safety too. Outside was the Red Death. It was towards the end of the 5th or 6th month of his confinement, and while the plague was raging without, that Prince Prospero gave his 1,000 friends a masked ball of rare beauty. The ball was a voluptuous spectacle. But let me first speak of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7 of them, quite an imperial space. There are many palaces, however, where such rooms offer a long linear perspective, with sliding doors running almost to the very walls on either side, so that hardly anything interrupts the view along their entire length. The case here was quite different, as might be expected from the Duke's fondness for the extravagant. The distribution of the rooms was so irregular that one could hardly see more than one at a time. Every 20 or 30 meters there was a sharp turn, and with each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of the wall, a tall, narrow Gothic window looked out onto a closed corridor that framed the sinuosities of the whole, with stained glass windows whose colors varied according to the dominant tones in the decoration of the room on which they opened. The easternmost chamber, for instance, was decorated in blue, and the windows in bright blue. The ornamentation and hangings of the second were purple, and the glass there was purple. The third was all green, as were the windows. The furniture and lighting of the fourth were orange. The 5th, white. The 6th, violet. The 7th room was a dense shroud of black velvet tapestries, which covered the ceiling and walls, and fell in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same hue and texture. But only in this room did the color of the windows differ from the decoration. The stained glass here was of a scarlet hue, a dark blood red. Now in none of the 7 chambers was there a lamp or a candelabra, amidst the abundance of gilt ornaments which were everywhere, or which hung from the ceilings. There was no light from lamp or candle in the whole suite of rooms, but in the passage which ran round the halls there stood, opposite each window, a heavy tripod with a brazier of fire, which, by throwing its glare through the stained glass, flooded the room with light. Thus a striking profusion of fantastic forms was produced. But in the black, or western, room the effect of the fire through the blood glass on the black hangings was most sinister, and gave such an unreal air to the faces of those who entered that very few dared to take a step into the room. Here, too, stood, against the west wall, a gigantic ebony clock. The pendulum swung with a low, dull, monotonous sound, and when the minute hand had run round the face, and the moment of striking the hour arrived, there issued from its metallic lungs a clear, powerful, deep, and very musical sound, but of such a peculiar note and emphasis that at every hour the musicians were obliged to pause for a moment to listen to it, which in turn compelled the dancers to cease their waltz, and a brief discomfiture was produced in the merriment of all. And as the chimes sounded, the more frivolous grew pale, and the more sedate with age passed their hands over their brows as if lost in reverie or meditation. But when the last echoes ceased, a faint laughter seized all the company at once. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if mocking their own nerves in confusion, and whispered mutual promises that the next chimes would no longer make the same impression on them. But then, after 60 minutes, which is 3,600 seconds of time that flies, the chimes would ring again, and the same meditation, the same confusion and nervousness as before would be repeated. But for all that it was a gay and magnificent party, the Duke's tastes were peculiar. He had a keen eye for color and effect. He disdained the conventions of fashion. His plans were bold and passionate, and a tinge of barbarism lit up his projects. Some would have thought him mad. His followers did not think so, but one had to hear him, and see him, and touch him, to be sure. On the occasion of this great feast, he had personally supervised almost all the decoration of the 7 rooms, and it was his own taste that had inspired the costumes. You can be sure that they were extravagant. There was a lot of ostentation and glitter, illusory and spicy, much of what has since been seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures, with grotesque limbs and attire. There were delirious fantasies such as only madmen can imagine. There was much beauty, much voluptuousness, much that was bizarre, something terrible, and not a little that might have offended. In fact, through the 7 rooms a multitude of dreams was majestically walking. And these, the dreams, roamed through the rooms, tinging themselves with the color of each one, and making the wild music of the orchestra seem like the echo of their footsteps. And then the ebony clock in the velvet room chimes, and for a moment everything is quiet, everything is silent except the voice of the clock. Dreams remain, frozen and motionless, but the echo of the bells dies away. They have lasted only an instant, and a faint, half-suppressed laughter floats behind it. And the music rises again, and the dreams live, and they toss about more joyfully than ever, tinted by the multicolored windows through which the gleam of the tripods penetrates. But in the western hall none of the masked men dares to enter now, because the night is already fading and a redder light filters through the blood-colored glass, and the blackness of the tapestries frightens, and whoever ventures his footsteps upon the black carpet hears a dull ticking, more solemn and emphatic than that which reaches the ears of those who give themselves over to merriment in the more distant rooms. But the other rooms were crowded, and the eagerness for life was throbbing feverishly in them. The festive whirlwind continued thus, until at last the clock struck midnight. Then the music ceased, as I have said, and the dancers stopped their waltz. And, as on other occasions, everything came to a restless standstill. But now 12 bells were to be struck, and so it happened, perhaps, that the more time there was, the more serious the reflections of those in the company who were already pensive. And so it happened, perhaps, that before the last echo of the last bell had died away in the silence, many had already noticed the presence of a masked figure who had hitherto attracted no attention. And word of this new presence spread from mouth to mouth, and soon a murmur arose throughout the company, a murmur of disapproval and surprise. Then, finally, of terror, horror, and disgust. In such a ghostly assembly as I have pictured, it may well be supposed that no ordinary costume would have created such a sensation. Indeed, that night freedom in disguise was practically unbounded, but the figure in question had gone too far, beyond even the bounds of the prince's permissive taste. There are fibers even in the hearts of the boldest which cannot be touched without being thrilled. Even hopeless cases, to whom life and death are one and the same joke, believe that there are certain matters which cannot be trifled with. In all the company, of course, there was now a strong feeling that the stranger's costume and bearing were devoid of all wit and decorum. He was a tall, gloomy figure, shrouded from head to foot in the garb of the grave. The mask which concealed it so faithfully represented the rigid countenance of a corpse that the most attentive observer would have found it difficult to discover the deception. Yet all this would have been endured, if not approved, this wild assembly. But the masked man had even assumed the appearance of the Red Death. Blood was spattered upon his garments, and his broad forehead and all his features were mottled with scarlet horror. As Prince Prospero's gaze fell upon this spectre, which walked slowly and solemnly, as if to give greater importance to its figure, he was struck with a convulsion, at first with a violent shudder of horror or disgust, but presently his face flushed with anger. "Who dared?" he asked in a hoarse voice to the courtiers accompanying him. "Who dared to insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and remove his mask, and then we will know who is to be hanged from a battlement at dawn." When he spoke these words, Prince Prospero was in the blue hall, which faced east, and his echo went loud and clear through the 7 rooms, for the prince was a strong and bold man, and one gesture from him had already silenced the music. It was in the blue drawing-room that the prince sat, in company with a group of pale courtiers. At first, when he spoke, they took a step towards the intruder, who was now near them, and who now came nearer still more, with a deliberate and stately bearing. But a certain inexpressible fear, which the foolish arrogance of the mask had inspired in the whole party, prevented anyone from laying a hand upon him. So that without hindrance he passed within a yard of the prince, and while in the drawing-rooms the numerous assemblage, as if moved by a single spring, stepped aside for the shelter of the walls, the masked man continued to walk with the same solemn and measured step that had distinguished him from the first, passing from the blue room to the purple room, from the purple to the green, from the green to the orange, from this to the white, and even from this to the purple, without anyone making the slightest attempt to stop him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, beside himself, and ashamed of his momentary cowardice, rushed through the 6 rooms, unfollowed by the mortal terror that had seized them all. He brandished a drawn dagger, and came swiftly and impetuously to within striking distance of the figure that pursued him, when the latter, having already reached the velvet hall, suddenly whirled and confronted him. There was a sharp cry, and the glittering dagger fell upon the black carpet, upon which Prince Prospero instantly fell prostrate in death. Then, carried by the mad courage of despair, a large party rushed into the black hall, where the tall figure still stood erect and motionless beneath the shadow of the ebony clock. But as they laid their hands upon the masked man, a nameless horror took their breath away, and they discovered that the shroud and the cadaverous mask, which they had handled with violent rudeness, were not inhabited by any tangible form. And they recognized the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one the people fell in the once festive halls, now bathed in blood, and each found death in the desperate position into which he fell. And the life of the ebony clock went out with the life of the last courtier, and the flames of the tripods went out, and all was taken over by darkness, corruption, and the Red Death. End of the Masque of the Red Death.